It was the moment he sits in his car in the parking structure with a ring box on the passenger seat and decides he isn't going to say one word about what he just saw. That silence becomes a strategy. Everything else follows from it. You're watching his eternal diary.
The jeweler smelled like cedar and cold metal. I remember that clearly, even now. The display cases had a particular chill to them. The air inside them never fully warmed up, and the man who helped me was older, white-haired, with a steady hand that handled the ring boxes the way surgeons handle instruments. Quietly, with the implication of precision. He had been doing this for a long time, and it showed in the economy of his movement. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. I had been to 3 jewelers before I found the right one. Not the most expensive place on Caldwell Street, but the most honest one. The stones were graded correctly. The settings were exactly what they said they were. I'd done my research the way I did all research, in order, without skipping steps, not moving to a conclusion until the work supported it. 3 shops, 3 conversations, 3 careful examinations of certificates under the desk loop the white-haired man offered without being asked. The ring I chose was a solitaire. A round, brilliant cut, 1.4 carats, set in platinum. Nothing theatrical. Isadora had a way of wearing things quietly, making them look like they'd always been there, like they'd been chosen by the room rather than by a person. And I wanted something that matched that, something that would look on her hand like it had never not been there. I paid on a card with no joint access. This was habit, not calculation. I kept my account separate from the shared ones Isadora and I maintained. We'd bought a flat together 18 months prior, split the equity, shared the household running costs through a joint account we both fed monthly. Everything else? My savings, on my investment accounts, my personal current account, I kept in my name. She had never asked about that arrangement. I had never explained it. Some habits don't require explanation. The ring came in a dark blue velvet box, small enough to disappear in a jacket pocket. I thanked the white-haired man and walked out into the afternoon. The sky was the color of old pewter. I remember standing outside the shop for almost 3 minutes, not from nerves, not from second thoughts, but because there was something pleasant about the quiet of the street in that particular afternoon light. The gray of it, the way it made everything look considered. I'd been planning the proposal for 2 weeks. The restaurant was booked. The moment was mapped out, though I knew the actual words would be different from any words I'd rehearsed. Because, in my experience, the real version of any important conversation is never the rehearsed one. The best things I'd ever said in my life were things I didn't know I was going to say. I found my car, unlocked it, set the ring box on the passenger seat, and reached into my jacket pocket for my phone. That was when I noticed. The phone in my hand was the wrong phone. Not the wrong phone. Isadora's phone. We both used the same matte black case, a choice that had been practical at the time we'd made it and was now, in this moment, something else entirely. She'd left hers on the kitchen counter that morning. I'd grabbed it by accident when I left for work. I turned it over in my hand. The screen lit up with a notification. A messaging app I recognized, the one with the green icon, the one a lot of people used. As the preview showed only the first line. I want to be precise about what happened in the next 3 seconds. I didn't read it in the way you read something you've chosen to read. I saw it before I'd registered that I was seeing it, the way your eyes catch movement before your brain names it. The name first, Conrad. And then 6 words that didn't mean anything individually but meant everything in sequence. Miss you already, counting down to Friday. I stood very still. The street was quiet. Someone walked past with a dog, and the dog looked up at me with the frank, uncomplex attention that dogs give to people who are standing very still. I set Isadora's phone face down on the passenger seat, next to the ring box. I stood there for another moment. Then I got in the car. I am a structural engineer by training and a project manager by practice. I had spent the better part of a decade at Aldercroft Development, a mid-sized firm that handled residential and commercial builds across the city. And what that career had drilled into me, over hundreds of thousands of hours of site work and specification review, was a single governing principle. The response to discovering something wrong in the load-bearing structure is not panic. Panic costs more than the problem. You assess. You establish the scope. You do not act until you understand exactly what you are dealing with. The phone required her face or her fingerprint. I put it face down on the seat. I picked up my own phone and checked the calendar reminder. Dinner reservation, 7:30. 3 hours. I drove home. I don't remember the drive with clarity. I remember the light change at Pemberton Road. I remember the radio playing something I didn't register. I remember parking below our building and sitting in the car for 4 minutes before I went upstairs. 4 minutes. Because I checked the time when I sat and when I opened the door. In those 4 minutes, I made the decision that determined everything that came after. I was not going to say a word, not yet, and possibly not for a long time. 6 words on a preview screen had ended things that were nothing and confirmed things that were everything, and I had no basis yet for knowing which one this was. I was going to find out. I was going to understand the scope of what I was dealing with, fully and clearly, before I took a single step in any direction. I was going to see clearly. That was the decision. Just that. To see clearly. Thus, I went upstairs. Isadora was in the kitchen. Music on, something acoustic and low, her Friday afternoon soundtrack. She was making something with garlic and white wine. She had a glass on the counter, and her hair was pinned up. She looked at me, and smiled the way she smiled when I came home, before she expected me, a slightly surprised version of welcome that had always been specific to her. "Thought you'd be later," she said. I held up her phone. "Grabbed yours this morning. Same case." The relief in her reach for it, that specific, too quick reach, I saw. I filed it. "I've been going crazy," she said. "Couldn't find it anywhere." "Should get different cases," I said. "We should." I poured a glass of water and stood at the counter. She checked her phone once. The fast, or sidelong check of someone who knows they're being watched and is trying not to look like they know, and set it face down by the hob. I saw that too. I filed it too. We went to the restaurant at 7:30. The reservation was at a place on the south side of the city, a room with dark wood and good lighting, and a menu that required attention. The food was excellent. Isadora ordered fish. She was in a good mood, the open kind, the kind that could look like nothing or could look like the elevated mood of someone who'd received a message they'd been waiting for. I had no way to know which one I was looking at, and I was honest with myself about that. We talked about her work. A client who was being difficult, a campaign that had finally found its shape. My week. A project I was managing on a brownfield site east of the city was 42 residential units, a client who kept pushing against structural requirements as though confidence were a substitute for engineering. She asked the right questions. I answered. We talked about a film neither of us had seen yet. She ordered dessert. I sat across from her the whole evening, and I looked at her with what I can only describe as clinical care. Not cold. I want to be precise about that distinction. Not cold. Care, in the clinical sense, attention that is full and accurate and does not perform feeling while it gathers information. I watched her hands. I watched the way she checked her phone once, briefly, under the table, when I went to the bathroom. I watched her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking at them. She was composed. She was always composed. Yes, that was part of what I had loved about her. That particular form of stillness, the kind that looked like confidence from outside, and could be anything at all from inside. The ring was in my jacket pocket for the entire dinner. I brought it home, in the same pocket. That night, after she was asleep, I went to the study. The room off the hallway that I used for work, with the window that looked over the back lane, dark and quiet. And I opened my laptop. I created a new folder on the hard drive, encrypted it under a password she wouldn't guess, and opened a plain text document. I typed the date and the time at the top. Then I wrote down, in order, everything I had seen and heard and registered since 6 minutes past 3 that afternoon. The preview message, the exact words, the name, the number of words in the name. Conrad. One name, us not generic, not a friend I recognized, not a family member she'd mentioned, not a work contact I'd heard about in passing. I wrote down her reach for the phone, the face-down placement, the check at the restaurant. I wrote down 3 questions at the bottom of the document. How long has this been happening? What do we share that I need to protect? What does she think she has? Then I closed the document and went to bed. That document would eventually run to 43 pages, but I didn't know that yet. In the morning, I made coffee, 2 cups, brought hers to the bedside table and went back to the kitchen with mine. Read the news. When she came in at 7:45 in a gray blazer, I said good morning and asked if she wanted eggs, and she said she'd pick something up on the way in. Ordinary. All of it ordinary. When I had decided on the performance, to be exactly who she expected me to be, while I built the picture of who she actually was. Not deception in the way she would have named it, more like patience. A considered delay between knowing and acting. Over the next 3 days, I made a list. What we shared was specific and documentable. A flat purchased 18 months ago. Joint mortgage. Both names on the deed. Unequal deposits. I had put in 60% of the down payment, she 40%. This was in the solicitor's completion statement, a copy of which I kept in a physical folder in my desk drawer at Aldercroft. I had a habit of keeping hard copies of financial documents. It had always seemed like simple caution. Now it seemed like something more. A joint current account used for shared expenses. Direct debits, groceries, utility bills. The cleaner who came on Tuesdays. Both our salaries fed into it monthly. Neither sole owner. A joint savings account started 2 years ago. Modest monthly contributions from both of us. Current balance, just over 18,000. I'd contributed approximately 11,000 of that. I made a note. Everything else was mine alone. My professional accounts, my personal savings, my ISA, an investment portfolio I'd been building since before I met her. Her financial equivalent, whatever she'd built in her own name, I could only estimate. I didn't need to know it precisely. I needed to know what we shared. On the 3rd day, I called Elliot. Elliot was one of my oldest friends, since the first year of university, when we'd both been in the same introductory engineering lecture before he'd pivoted to law and I hadn't. And he was a property solicitor now, ran his own small firm, and had the quality I most valued in people I trusted. He heard information without reacting to it. He waited until a picture was complete before he drew any conclusions from it. He was, in that sense, someone I'd chosen as a friend for the same reason I'd become good at my job. I called him from my office with the door closed on a Thursday afternoon. "Are you asking me a professional question?" he said, "or a personal one?" "Both?" A short pause. He moved somewhere quieter. Go ahead. I told him what I had. Not the emotional version. There wasn't one to give, the factual one, what I'd seen, what I'd since confirmed behaviorally, what I still didn't know. He listened without a word, until I finished. "When were you going to propose?" he said. I didn't tell you that." "You've had a particular kind of tension about you for 2 months, I guessed. When were you going to?" "Tuesday, dinner, didn't." "Good. Tell me about the property again." I walked him through it, the deposit split, the mortgage terms, the registered ownership, the joint savings. He asked 3 specific questions: whether there was a cohabitation agreement, whether the deposit split had ever been acknowledged in writing between us, and whether there was documentation of my individual contributions at the time of purchase. No cohabitation agreement. Most couples didn't have them. We hadn't discussed it. He'd expected that. The deposit split was in the solicitor's completion statements, which showed precisely how each amount had moved from which account. And the mortgage had been structured primarily against my income. I was the higher earner by a significant margin. And this, too, was in the original paperwork. "That's your foundation," Elliot said. "Without a cohabitation agreement, you're in common law territory, which is fact-specific and can go several ways. But documented contributions of that kind, provable, in the paperwork, undisputed at the time, give you a beneficial interest argument that can exceed the 50-50 legal title. Your name and hers are equal on the deed. What each of you actually owns in equitable terms is a different question, and the answer depends on what you can prove." What do I need to do? Start building the record. Not just the infidelity, that's relevant context, but it's not the legal mechanism in a property dispute unless you have a specific clause. And so what you need is a complete financial timeline. Every pound you put in, when, documented by what. If there are large contributions you made during the relationship, beyond the deposit, those are significant. There was one. I'd been waiting for the right moment to mention it. 14 months ago, when we'd switched mortgage products, there had been an early repayment charge, a significant one. I had transferred £12,000 from my personal savings into the joint account to cover it. I had a bank record showing the transfer. I had a note in my personal accounts identifying what the payment was for, and I had an email to the mortgage broker from the time, in which I had mentioned the amount by name, confirming the source of funds. Elliot was quiet for a moment. "Forward me that email tonight." "I will. That's important. A scalum, a £12,000 documented contribution made during the relationship, on top of the deposit disparity, is a material piece of evidence in a beneficial interest argument. It shows continued investment. It shows that the financial reality of the property diverged from the equal legal title from early on. I wasn't thinking about that when I paid it. That's exactly what makes it useful, he said. You weren't strategizing. You were paying a bill. The documents reflect that. He told me not to make any sudden financial movements. No account closures, no large transfers, nothing that could be characterized as flight if things went legal. He told me to document everything going forward, my own conduct as well as hers. He told me to build a record of myself as someone who had responded to information with order, not chaos. The record works in both directions, he said. What you find about her, yes, but also what you do. A person who discovers a betrayal and responds methodically, through proper channels, with everything documented, looks entirely different from a person who reacts emotionally and makes mistakes. The first version of you is the one that gets good outcomes. I know, I said. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. We talked for another 15 minutes about procedural steps. He said nothing about how I was feeling, and I said nothing about how I was feeling, which was exactly the conversation I needed. That evening I forwarded the mortgage email. He confirmed receipt within the hour. I opened the encrypted folder and added a new entry to the document. I noted the call with Elliot, summarized the key points, and listed the documents I'd need to compile. Then, I spent 2 hours going through 18 months of joint account statements, all downloadable as PDFs from the banking app, and began a detailed line-by-line export into a spreadsheet. What I found, midway through the 3rd month of statements, was the first anomaly: a recurring transfer. Not large, £350 every 4 weeks out of Isadora's personal account into one I didn't recognize. Not from the joint account, from hers. I could see it, because the joint account statements showed her monthly deposits and what she'd moved, and in cross-referencing with what I knew of her salary, there was a gap. Small, but consistent. Starting 14 months ago. I noted the dates. I noted the amounts. I made no conclusions. 14 months ago. Gason, the same month, I'd made the 12,000 lump sum payment. I sat with that for a while, not jumping to any reading of it, just noting the coincidence of timing, noting it and documenting it. The next evening, I opened a private browsing session and searched LinkedIn. Meridian Strategies. Conrad. 3 results in the city. I went through them carefully. The one I settled on was a man called Conrad Tobias, account director at Meridian Strategies, in the same office as Isadora. 2 years in his current role. Previous position: senior strategist at Hargrove Communications. His LinkedIn photo was the kind that gets used by men who are described in certain rooms as impressive, professionally lit, well-framed, nothing incriminating about it. He'd been at Meridian for 2 years. Isadora had been there for 3. I closed the laptop, and I sat in the study with the window dark and thought about what I knew and what I still didn't know. The what I still didn't know was how long, how deep, whether she was planning to leave or planning to stay, or planning to manage 2 things simultaneously for an indefinite stretch. Each answer to that question required a different response from me. I needed more information before I knew which one I was dealing with. In the meantime, I documented. The record was growing into something I trusted the way you trust a well-built foundation. Not because I'd been fastidious about it, though I had, but because it was accurate. Every entry was a verified fact with a dated source. Nothing was asserted without evidence. Nothing was embellished. This was, I recognized, how I approached every significant problem professionally. Identify the issue. Establish the scope. Build the record. Do not move until you understand exactly what you're dealing with. In the 2nd week, I took the investigation of the timeline a step further. The shared computer in the study, a laptop we both occasionally used for personal tasks, though Isadora primarily used her own machine, had a browser that retained session history unless it was manually cleared. I installed a metadata viewer, free and open source, and looked at the session data for the past few months. Not the messages themselves, which were encrypted and inaccessible without authorization. What was visible was the metadata. Timestamps of when specific platforms had been accessed, the duration of sessions, the pattern of usage over time. What I found required me to sit very still for several minutes. The messaging platform that Conrad had sent his message on, the Green Icon app, had been accessed on the shared computer on multiple evenings over the past months. The sessions were long, 90 minutes, 2 hours, 2.5. Not every evening, but frequent, regular. The session logs ran back to the limit of what the cache had retained, almost 11 months. 11 months. I'd started planning the proposal 2 months ago. For more than 9 months before I began thinking about the ring, she had been doing this. I wrote the date range in the document. 11 months minimum. I added a note. The cash retention limits the look-back. Actual duration may be longer. I cross-referenced the session dates against the calendar, against the dates of the recurring financial transfers, against the dates of the Friday evening patterns that I'd now begun tracking. The transfers had started 14 months ago. The session history went back 11. The gap between those 2 points, 3 months, I noted carefully. Either the transfers predated the communications, which told one story, or the communication had moved to a more secure platform after an earlier period on one that left traces. Both versions were documented. I didn't select between them. Then I noted the Friday pattern. 3 consecutive Fridays. Isadora had worked late. First week, a client call that ran. Second week, a report due Monday. Third week, a team obligation, something vague. I had not asked probing questions in any case. I'd said it was fine. So I'd gone to the gym and run on the treadmill for 40 minutes each time, and thought with the particular clarity that physical effort produces. In the 4th week, she came home from the office at the normal time on a Friday, and she was in a specific kind of mood I'd come to recognize in the 2 years we'd lived together. Elevated, slightly compressed at the edges, the mood of someone who has had an afternoon that went very well and is working to bring it down to an appropriate register before walking through a shared door. I made dinner. She talked. I listened. The next day she was fully herself again, the everyday version, the one I had no complaints about. And that was, in its way, more clarifying than the elevated version had been. Because the switch between the two was too practiced, too clean. I wrote none of this in the document. These were observations, not evidence. The document only contained what I could verify. In week 3, I called Elliot again. This time the conversation was more specific. I had the spreadsheet open. I walked him through the financial contributions timeline, the lump sum, the monthly mortgage weights, the savings account breakdown. He listened with occasional questions. When I finished, he said, "How many pages is the document at?" 17. Keep going. The thickness of the record is itself significant. A document that began the day you found out and has been continuously maintained, with source documents attached, tells a story of someone who was building a case, not a reaction. "There's something else," I said. "The session logs, browser metadata." "What kind?" "A messaging platform. Timestamps, durations. No content. I can't access content without her password, and I'm not going to." "You don't need the content. The timestamps establish the pattern. The duration establishes the regularity. Those go in the document with an explanation of how they were obtained. Shared machine, default, cache. No authorization required." "Will it hold?" "It won't be challenged. The platform logs are what they are, and the method of retrieval is legitimate, but more importantly, the pattern it shows reinforces the financial timeline. When the financial and behavioral evidence align, the picture becomes coherent. Courts and legal representatives respond to coherent pictures." I said I understood. "The document," Elliot said. "Keep it exactly as it is. Factual, dated, no editorializing. Every entry reads like a log. Well, it's not like a case argument. The argument comes from the pattern. The pattern speaks without you having to." I spent that evening adding the session log data to the record. I included a technical note on the methodology. That the metadata viewer was a standard tool, freely available, that it retrieved publicly stored browser data from a shared machine without requiring any authorization or circumventing any security. I added the disclaimer because I wanted the document to be clean. No ambiguity about how anything was obtained. No reliance on anything that could be questioned. The document was now 20 pages. In week 4, I began Phase 2. Phase 2 was about positioning. Not just the record, but preparation. The difference between knowing what had happened and being ready for what came next. The first move was the investment portfolio. As I had 3 positions I'd been intending to restructure for months, too heavily weighted toward one sector, a rebalance long overdue. I moved the restructuring forward, brought the positions into more liquid vehicles, timed the moves to a written note I'd made to myself 6 months prior, documented in my investment platform, time-stamped, about reviewing the composition before year-end. I'd moved the action forward by 2 months. The intention was provable from before anything had happened with Isadora. Everything looked like what it was. It was what it was. The second move was professional. I had been at Aldercroft for 9 years, and I had, over that time, built a specific set of relationships that were mine, and only mine. What the structural engineer I had worked with on 4 consecutive residential projects, a man who trusted my judgment because I'd earned it, project by project. The quantity surveyor who called me first when numbers on a new tender needed a sense check. The planning consultant who was often useful months before a project went to public tender and who remembered correctly that I was a person worth calling. I started refreshing those relationships. Not urgently, nothing that would read as departure preparation to anyone watching. A message to check in, a coffee scheduled, a follow-up on something we'd last discussed before the autumn. I was reminding people who already knew me well that I was available to be known. Because what you take with you when you leave, from anything, a firm, a relationship, and any structure you've been part of, is your professional standing. Your known quality, the way your name operates in rooms you're not in. That was mine. It required no documentation because it lived in the professional memory of people who had worked beside me, and those people weren't going anywhere. The third move was the one that required a conversation. I went to Dana. Dana was my most senior project coordinator at Aldercroft, someone who had been at the firm longer than I had, and who possessed a form of institutional knowledge that was entirely unwritten. She knew how the firm actually operated, as opposed to how its org chart suggested it did, and she had an accurate observation habit that I'd always respected. She also had, I believed, a good sense of what the firm looked like from inside its own logic, where the ceilings were, where the rooms were, and what the options were for someone who'd hit one but hadn't exhausted the others. I brought it as a professional conversation, and it was a professional conversation. I told her I'd been thinking about what came next, that the director-level ceiling was real, and I felt it, that I'd been too comfortable for slightly too long. She listened in her characteristic way, very still, taking in more than she showed. And then she said there was someone who might be worth a conversation. Crispin, the most senior project director at the firm, the founding name on the signage, the one whose trajectory everyone at Aldercroft eventually had to account for in their own career planning. He'd been in a particular kind of thinking for about a year, Dana said, about what the transition out of full operational involvement looked like, about what the firm needed to carry the weight of the large residential commissions once he wasn't the one doing it. He hasn't found the right person yet, she said. Has he looked? She gave me a specific look. He's been waiting for someone to start the conversation. I thanked her. I scheduled the meeting for the following week. At home, Through all of this, I was the person Isadora expected. That was the continuous work of it, not the documentation, which took an hour or two in the evenings, and was, if anything, calming in its orderliness. The work was being present, cooking when I cooked, watching what we watched, asking the question she'd want asked about the things she'd mentioned at breakfast, refilling the wine, and noticing when she was tired and not filling the silence with conversation, being the version of myself she had built her expectations around. I was performing it, and I was not performing it. Both things were true. The version of me she expected was a version of me I recognized. The care I took at dinner was care I actually had. I can't fully explain how you continue to care for someone you know has been deceiving you for the better part of a year. Except that 4 years of building a life with a person doesn't evaporate on a Tuesday afternoon, and the grief of it lives in its own compartment while the rest of you keeps moving. The ring was in my desk drawer at Aldercroft. Next to the completion statement, the ring and the completion statement, in the same drawer. I thought about that sometimes, when in moments that weren't particularly meaningful and weren't particularly not. When I was making coffee in the morning, when I was driving between sites. The specific weight of a velvet box, the specific geometry of a document with a stamp on it, both of them facts about the same 4 years, both of them mine. In week 5, something Isadora said shifted the texture of things slightly. We were in the car, driving home from a dinner with her university friends, a group I'd known for 3 years, some of them people I genuinely liked. She was quiet after dinners like this, in the decompression mode she always moved into when a social evening was over, and the drive home had a particular solitude to it. After a few minutes, she said, "Are you happy?" I turned the question over before I answered it. "Why do you ask? You seem different, or steady in a different way than usual, like you've arrived somewhere." She was, I noted, a perceptive person. She had always been perceptive. It was one of the things about her that had made the discovery so dissonant. The idea that a perceptive person hadn't been able to see what she was doing to the thing she was looking at every day. But she was reading me now, and she wasn't entirely wrong. "I've decided to stop waiting on some professional things," I said. "I think I've been comfortable at Aldercroft for slightly too long." She absorbed this. "You're thinking about leaving?" "I'm thinking about options." A pause. "That makes sense. Not with warmth, with something closer to relief, the specific quality of a person who had been bracing for one answer and had received a different one. I noted that quality. I filed it. Thus I drove the rest of the way home with a clear head. The Crispin conversation happened on a Wednesday. He met me in the conference room that looked out over the east side of the city, the brownfield site where the 42 units were now at frame stage, the scaffolding visible through the glass like a skeleton in the middle distance. Crispin was in his late 50s, still technically the most powerful person in the firm, and he moved with the particular economy of someone who has spent decades learning that almost nothing requires urgency. I told him plainly what I could do and what I'd built. The project portfolio, the client relationships that were specifically mine, the technical depth, the track record at the firm. I didn't undersell, and I didn't oversell. I told him what I needed in return: a revised contract, thus a defined pathway to a partnership stake, a financial structure that reflected the level at which I was already operating. He looked at me for a moment after I finished. "I've been waiting for this conversation for about 2 years," he said. "I know," I said. You've been too comfortable. I know that too. We agreed on a formal follow-up in 10 days. He shook my hand before I left. His grip was the grip of someone who'd decided something before the meeting started. I added the meeting to the log that evening, noted its outcome, noted that the professional layer was proceeding on schedule. The document was 28 pages. In week 6, the record gave me something I hadn't been looking for. I was going back through the joint account statements. I checked them monthly now, a habit. And I noticed something I'd seen but hadn't fully registered before. Among the transactions in the months just before I'd found the phone, there were 4 charges to a hotel I didn't recognize. The Fenwick in the city. Small charges, the kind that correspond to a bar tab or a room service order rather than a full booking. But on 4 separate dates. Dates that, when I cross-referenced against my own work diary, corresponded to evenings when I'd been away on site visits. I noted them. I noted the hotel name. I did not conclude anything I could not prove. But I did add a column to the financial spreadsheet labeling each unrecognized charge with the date, the amount, and whether I had been in the city that day. In 4 cases, I had not. But I also added a note to the document that the financial record contained charges consistent with a pattern of dates when I was absent. That was all. The document had a note. The note had no editorializing. The pattern was visible without it. In week 7, Isadora mentioned the savings account. She brought it up at breakfast, casually, in the manner of something she'd been thinking about without urgency. She thought she might need to reduce her monthly contribution for a few months. Things at work were a bit stretched. She hoped that was all right. I said it was fine. I looked up the account balance that afternoon, $17,800, of which I had contributed roughly $11,000. I documented the balance, the date, and the fact that she had initiated the conversation about her own contribution reduction, not I. Once I thought about the timing. She had no reason to think anything had changed between us. The performance had been exact. And yet she was managing her outgoing finances more carefully. I thought about the recurring transfers I'd found in her account data, the £350 every 4 weeks for 14 months. I thought about the hotel charges. I thought about Conrad Tobias and his 2 years at Meridian and his LinkedIn photo taken in good light. I had 11 months of browser session data, 14 months of recurring transfers, 4 hotel-consistent charges on evenings I'd been out of the city. I did not yet know the full scope of what I was dealing with, but I had a detailed record of its outline, and the outline was large. In week 8, Isadora began what I recognized from years of living with her, done as a pre-change cleaning ritual. It was a specific habit of hers. Before any significant transition in her life, she prepared the environment around her for the coming change by creating physical order. I'd seen it the year before, when she'd taken a project team abroad for a fortnight. She'd reorganized 3 drawers and cleaned out the fridge before she left. I'd seen it when she'd changed jobs at the firm she worked at before Meridian. She'd taken a Saturday afternoon and gone through the wardrobe and thrown out a bag of things, and then looked satisfied in a quiet, settled way. She started cleaning. She reorganized the wardrobe. She went through the shelf in the hallway where we kept accumulated paper, bills, bank letters, restaurant cards. She cleared out items from the fridge that were at the edge of their dates. And she took a Tuesday evening and went through the storage in the spare room. I watched all of this and said nothing. She was preparing for something coming. The timeline she was on was shorter than I'd thought. I sent Elliot a message. "Ready when you are." He called within the hour. We talked for 40 minutes. He walked me through the letter, a formal communication from his office to Isadora proposing a meeting, through respective solicitors, to discuss the future of the shared property. Not aggressive, entirely procedural. A practical communication about a practical matter that would have to be addressed eventually. The function of the letter, Elliot said, is to put the property question on the formal record, on your timeline, framed in your terms. If she's already planning to raise it, you've moved first. If she hasn't yet, you've defined the opening position. Either way, the conversation happens in the correct environment, through solicitors with everything documented, rather than in a kitchen. When does it go? When you say. Give me 1 week. I spent that week with Isadora in the way I'd spent the previous 8. Ordinary evenings, cooking on alternate nights, watching something on television I no longer remember. One evening she fell asleep on the sofa with the lights still on and the sound turned down, her feet tucked under her in the way she slept on sofas, and I sat beside her for a while before I went to bed. I want to be honest about that moment, not dramatic about it, just honest. I sat beside her for about 20 minutes. She was asleep. She looked the way people look when they're asleep, which is the way they look when nothing is being managed or presented, just a person, breathing, present. And I looked at her with something that wasn't grief, and wasn't anger, and wasn't anything that had a clean name. Something that acknowledged that what we had built over 4 years was real. That the hours in this flat, and the dinners, and the conversations, and the Saturday mornings, and all of it had been real. And that none of that realness protected it from being what it also was. The inspection was booked. The project was complete. What I was doing now was the last walk of the site before handover. I got up and went to bed. On a Wednesday morning, from my office at Aldercroft, I sent Elliot 1 word. He filed the letter that afternoon. Isadora received it by 6 o'clock. She called me at 6:15, whilst I was in the car park below the office, the evening light sitting flat and gray over the city, the scaffolding on the brownfield site visible in the middle distance. "What is this?" she said. "A letter from my solicitor about the flat," I said. "I can see what it is. Why is this?" She stopped. Reset. The composure was intact at the edges, but I could hear the seam of it under strain. "Are you ending this?" "I'm proposing that we have a conversation through the appropriate people." "Is there something you want to say to me directly?" "Not at the moment," I said. A long silence. Long enough that I heard the ambient noise of wherever she was. The street, the outside of her office building, somewhere with traffic. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay." I drove home. She was already there when I arrived. And she was sitting at the kitchen table, the printed letter in front of her, and she had been crying. Within the past hour, I estimated. The redness around her eyes was still visible despite having washed her face. She had tried to compose the composition, and the composition had mostly held. I put my bag down. I got a glass of water. I sat across from her at the table. "I want to understand what's happening," she said. "I think you know," I said. The look on her face when I said that was the first moment in 10 weeks where the composure, which was considerable and which I had come to have a sort of professional respect for, came apart. Just briefly. Just enough for me to see what was behind it. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough," I said. She looked at the table, then up at me. I didn't know how—" She stopped. Started again. "There's no version of this that doesn't sound—" "I'm not looking for a version," I said. "I'm looking for an orderly process." She stared at me. I understood what she was looking for in that stare. The confrontation. The anger displayed, The hurt performed, the reaction that would tell her where the edges were and give her something to push against. What she'd found instead was someone who had already finished the interior work, someone who had arrived at this table with the documentation in order and nothing left to prove. "You're not angry," she said. "I made my peace with it a while ago." "How long ago?" "The night you were looking for your phone." She was very still. "And you just continued?" "I continued," I said. She looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded, but once a small, sharp nod that had nothing to do with agreement. It was the nod of someone whose assessment of a situation has been significantly and permanently revised. "The money," she said after a moment. "The things I put in." "Everything is documented," I said. "Every contribution from both sides. Elliot has it all." "Elliot." She processed that. "You've been talking to him for a while." I didn't confirm or deny. "How much do you have?" she said. And then immediately, I mean how complete is it? The record." "Complete enough," I said. She absorbed this the way you absorb information that is unwelcome but not surprising, with the particular quality of recognition that arrives when something you suspected has been confirmed without fanfare. "Callum," her voice had changed register. "Did you know, or that night, when you came home with my phone, what you were going to do?" I thought about the honest answer. "I knew I was going to find out exactly what I was dealing with," I said. "I didn't know what I'd do until I understood the full scope of it." She nodded again, the slow version this time. "Right." I went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. The ring was in the drawer at Aldercroft. The completion statement was in the same drawer. A velvet box and a document, same drawer, 10 weeks apart in their significance. I thought about standing outside the jeweler in the gray afternoon light. I thought about the 4 minutes in the car. I thought about the decision I'd made in those 4 minutes, which was not a complicated decision. It was just the decision to see clearly. That was all it had ever been. As the property negotiation ran 6 weeks, Elliot submitted the full documentation package to Isadora's solicitor, a careful, deliberate man called Absalom, within 10 days of filing the letter. The package contained the original completion statement showing the 60-40 deposit split, the bank records of my deposit payment and hers, the email to the mortgage broker noting the $12,000 lump sum, the full mortgage contribution history weighted by salary, the joint account statements for 18 months, the savings account breakdown showing my $11,000 against her $6,800, 43 pages of source documentation, organized chronologically, each item referenced in a covering schedule that Elliot and I had built together. Absalom raised the equal legal title, and it was the only argument available to him. The deed said 50-50, which was true. Elliot responded with the beneficial interest argument in full. When legal title and actual financial contribution diverge, equitable law can recognize a beneficial interest that differs from the registered title. The question is what the contributions show. And the contributions showed, clearly and completely, a pattern of financial investment that exceeded the 50% registered title from the day of purchase. Absalom wrote back. He requested more time to review the documentation. He was given 2 weeks. At the end of 2 weeks, Absalom wrote again. He raised a counterclaim that Isadora had made non-financial contributions to the household during the relationship, domestic labor, personal investment, but the intangible kinds of contribution that courts have sometimes recognized in the absence of a cohabitation agreement. Elliot responded. The domestic contribution argument was well established in certain fact patterns, but required specific evidence to be applied, and it operated alongside the financial contribution record rather than replacing it. In cases where the financial record was clear and documented and undisputed, the weighting of financial contributions was the primary driver of beneficial interest calculation. He also noted, in his letter, that the financial record showed an uninterrupted history of primary investment in the property from one party from the date of purchase. He did not reference anything in the behavioral record. He didn't need to. The financial record was sufficient on its own. Absalom took another week, and then he proposed a settlement figure. 58% to me, 42% to Isadora. Elliot called me. He said the opening position was reasonable for Isadora to have started from, and that there was room to negotiate upward without a significant fight. "What do you want?" he said. "Something that reflects what I actually put in. 63, 65 is achievable. I wouldn't push further, or it becomes contested and takes 3 times as long." 63, I said, "and a clean split on the savings in proportion to contributions." He went back. Absalom came back at 61. Elliot held at 63. Absalom accepted. I never met Absalom. I spoke to Elliot on the phone. The negotiation lived entirely in letters and emails and a spreadsheet that tracked the positions at each round. So the savings account divided at roughly 9,700 to me, 8,100 to Isadora. The difference was small. I accepted it without argument because Elliot had advised taking a modest haircut to keep the process moving, and the advice was right. The flat went to market 6 weeks after that. The estate agents were efficient. We had a buyer within 4 days of listing. A young couple, first purchase, mortgage in order, and the sale completed in 5 weeks. I received my 63% of the equity plus my full deposit return. It was a significant sum. It went into the personal account at the new bank, sitting alongside the restructured investment positions, and became the foundation of something cleaner than anything I'd had before. I was not in the city when the sale completed. I was on site in the north. A new project that Crispin and I were developing together under the new contract. A mixed-use commission on a converted industrial plot, the kind of work I'd been wanting to lead for 2 years. I got the completion confirmation by email. I read it once, filed it in the appropriate folder, and went back to the site meeting. The partnership contract with Crispin had been signed the previous month. It was, in plain terms, a material improvement on everything I'd had before. Better compensation structure, a defined pathway to equity, a scope of work that matched what I was actually capable of, rather than what the previous ceiling had allowed for. Crispin had said, on the morning I signed it, "Steady hand." I'd said, "Working on it." It was one of those pieces of dry shorthand that both people understand to be more than it says. In the weeks after the flat sale, I set up my new place properly. A 1-bedroom in a quiet street I'd liked on first sight, with a small park visible from the kitchen window that I hadn't known I was going to value the way I came to value it. I finished unpacking. I'd been living out of boxes for 3 weeks in the way you live out of boxes when the job hasn't stopped, just because the personal life has. I bought a proper coffee machine. I acquired a plant that the woman at the shop said was difficult to kill, and I was skeptical, but she'd been right so far. The ring had come back from the Aldercroft desk drawer the evening after I signed the partnership contract. I hadn't planned to retrieve it that specific day. I'd gone back to the drawer for a structural report I'd left there, and the velvet box had been under it, and I'd picked it up with the same automatic care I'd been giving it since the day I bought it. I put it in my jacket pocket and drove home. In the kitchen of the new flat, I took it out and set it on the counter. I looked at it for a while. The stone was exactly as it had been. Round, brilliant, clear. 1.4 carats. Platinum setting. Honest materials, honestly represented by a white-haired man who handled things with the precision of someone who knew that what he was holding mattered even when he couldn't know for whom. I didn't feel anything particular looking at it. I registered it. I registered that the day I bought it and the day I set it on this counter were different chapters of the same project, and that both of them were real, and neither of them canceled the other out. There was something Elliot had said to me once, years before any of this, when he was new to the law and had already seen more dissolution than most people accumulate in a lifetime. He'd said, "The ones who come out cleanest are the ones who keep records and keep their heads. The ones who lose most are the ones who lose track of the difference between what they know and what they feel." I'd been thinking about that in one way or another for the past 4 months. I knew what I had. I'd built the record. I'd positioned the assets. I'd prepared the professional layer and executed the property negotiation and moved when it was time to move, not before. What I felt was a separate category. It had been a separate category from the evening I'd sat in the car park 4 minutes longer than I'd needed to. It would continue being a separate category for however long it continued. The ring was in the kitchen drawer now, next to the coffee grinder and a torch I'd meant to put somewhere more logical. Not for any particular reason. Not as a statement, just because I'd put it down when I came in and the drawer was open and that was where it went. I went to the window and looked at the park in the dark, just the shapes of trees and the orange wash of the streetlights, quiet and still, and thought about the next morning and the site meeting and the specifications I needed to review before it. There was work to do. There was always work to do. I went to bed.